Well, great. Sounds like we've overcome our technological hurdles, so excellent first step. Hi, everyone. It's great to have you joining in person or via Zoom. And thank you for the invitation to talk today about One Health. I think it has really an exciting fit with this year's Water Seminar Series theme of water, livestock, and wildlife. So I'm going to expand out a little bit to include domestic animals generally. So thinking about pets and stray animals as well as livestock, because I think they're all really important in health connections. So as Anne mentioned, my name's Liz, and I work in the School of Veterinary Medicine and the School of Natural Resources, and I coordinate the Nebraska One Health program. And we're going to dive into One Health today. I'll make you that promise. But first, I would like to ask you to embark on a little activity or experiment with me. This is the participatory fun section of the seminar. So I'm going to ask that if you're in person, you use the note card I gave you or your own piece of paper. And if you're on Zoom, you grab a piece of paper or an imaginary piece of paper. And I'd like for you to think of a place where you really feel at home, a place that you love in the world. It can be urban or rural, it can be built or natural. And I'd like you to visualize that place and try to just draw a quick sketch of it or to describe it in a few words on your piece of paper. And I'll give you the inspiration of this beautiful woodcut from an art science series in a journal in Maine. Okay, and while you're envisioning that, I want you to think about what wildlife or domestic animals are present, what plants are here in the place that you love. And where do they connect with water in this place? I see some intensive focus and writing happening. I love it. I can see you visualizing these places. Okay, if you keep humoring me, I'd like us to go below the surface of this place. And I'd like you to think about where water exists. Maybe it's really clear and it's a stream or a river or an ocean. And maybe it's hidden in the fabric of your landscape. I want you to take the time to intentionally think about where is water in this place for you. And as a final step, I want you to think about where do water and animals and people and plants connect? What's a health benefit or a health challenge that they share here? All right, I'm seeing a lot of ready-looking faces to proceed, and I want to thank you all for humoring me. The reason that I wanted to try this is because I wanted us to all have a place of personal grounding as you think about some of the One Health stories that I'm going to share that are scattered throughout the world and bring in really different elements and connections with wildlife and domestic animals and humans and water. So as you're thinking about your place, hold that in your mind, and we'll go on some collaborative One Health explorations. And I'll show you a quick glimpse of my place. The place when I made myself do this exercise was a tree in my backyard in Michigan growing up where I used to hide away to read. And I could sort of sit above the yard and hear my family and our dogs moving around. I could hear the squirrels and the birds around me. And I could feel the sun and the wind, and I felt could smell the spicy resin of the sap soaking into my clothes. And that was a place where I felt completely safe and at home. And it occurred to me that I've always felt really excited about the connection between story and the world around us and how we use story as well as science to interpret the health that binds people, animals, and our shared environments. So that's my place. Keep your place in mind. So I promised that we were going to dive into One Health. I know from some of your faces that you're very familiar with One Health. I'm guessing some people might be newer to that concept as well. And it's really both a concept and an approach. So One Health is based on the idea that the health of people, animals, both domestic and wild, plants, and the environments or ecosystems that we share are interdependent. And so it's to our detriment to try to separate out, the way we manage public health or water management or wildlife conservation, because they're woven together in the fabric of, this Nebraska watershed or whatever place it is that you've chosen mentally as well. So I asked you to think of a connection point for the health of people, animals, and the environment. And I'm guessing that if we went around the room and had time to share, everyone would either have something very unique or we'd see some really core overlapping themes. And I think collectively we've probably got a lot of examples. One extremely relevant one for many people today is the COVID-19 pandemic, right? So we've just lived through multiple years of the pandemic where a zoonotic pathogen, a coronavirus, whose closest known relatives is in wildlife and bats, has reshaped the fabric of our world, right? Has changed our personal and maybe our family health experiences, has changed the way we educate our youth and adults in the United States and around the world. And it's caused really big problems for global economic systems and supply chains. And that's just one zoonotic pathogen. So we can keep that in mind as an example of a type of connection between people, animals, plants, and environments. And the BBC here at the beginning of the pandemic is asking us to consider, why are we seeing more cases of this? Why are we seeing diseases emerge that are shared between animals and people, zoonotic diseases? And there are a lot of reasons that can help explain this. We'll dive into some of them. And I want us to remember that there are a lot of different types of zoonotic diseases. So the coronavirus that caused the SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus that caused COVID-19 is one example, but there are existing and emerging zoonotic pathogens that can be bacteria, viruses, parasites, prions, and fungal pathogens, and they can cut across really diverse animal and human systems. So as we keep that in mind, we know that there's strong evidence, if we think about the emerging zoonotic diseases, that many of those, the majority of them, have a wildlife origin, really bringing in that connection to wild animals throughout the world. And so if we think about diseases like this that show up either in a new population or a new environment or are new to scientific discovery, a lot of times people tend to think of really common wildlife reservoirs. So some that might pop to mind are insectivorous or fruit bats, right? Animals that can share pathogens like rabies and coronaviruses with humans. You might also think of rodents or small mammals that are closely living in proximity to people within our houses, in our agricultural fields, or other peri-domestic environments. In some areas of the world, primates might play a critical role in disease wildlife-human connections because of the close evolutionary relationships. That's probably not a Nebraska scenario unless something a little weird is going on, but something to think about as we consider distributions globally. So I mentioned that the majority of emerging zoonoses are shared with wildlife, but there are many zoonotic diseases that can cross from domestic animals to people as well. And this is a picture that is commonly used to represent these, and I think it shares a couple of different stories here. So that kid in the picture looks very happy to me to be interacting with this pig. And I think that's a critical piece to consider is the relevance and the importance of the human-animal bond, right? We have, if you thought of the place and the animals there, we have connection both to domestic animals in and outside of our homes, the livestock in our production systems, as well as the wildlife sharing diverse habitats with us. But given the close proximity and potential respiratory exchange and maybe saliva exchange, if either of these, the person or the animal, has, let's say, an influenza virus, that could easily cross the species boundary. So we're constantly navigating both the benefits and the challenge of the human-animal relationship and the human-nature relationship, as well as the fact that there are some very real shared health challenges that we have to consider as well. I think that tension is also there with many of the wildlife in our world. So in diverse areas, bats are villainized or persecuted as bearers of disease or animals that might bite humans, but they also play incredibly critical roles in ecosystems throughout the globe. They're really important in controlling agricultural pests or mosquito populations. They can be incredibly vital as architects of forests through seed dispersal and pollination. So with both the wildlife and the domestic animal-human relationship, we're navigating what does it mean to be in connection and what does it mean to protect health on both sides. And it's a complex thing to navigate and to think about because there are a lot of forces acting upon this. We can think about zoonotic diseases at many scales, and you'll see water threaded throughout a lot of these images. I promise we'll go deep into the water connection here as well. But you can think about the human immune system or the animal immune system at the very host local level. You can think about where we connect with pathogens and other animals in a local area as well. And we can think about broader spread between different types of agricultural and built and natural systems at the regional level. And then we can think of large-scale forces that shape global spread when we think about pandemics. And that might be human oriented forces like global travel and trade and transportation that move people and animals and plants and pieces around the world. But it could also be natural migratory systems and distribution of wildlife hosts that are crossing many country and continental boundaries. So we have complex spatial and temporal scales that are influencing how we share pathogens, in this example, with the animals and the environments around us. And I want to point out that this image and many of the gorgeous graphic design images that you see are created by Abby Snyder, who's our One Health graphic and web designer. So kudos to her creativity in illustrating some of these tough concepts. And not only do we have these interacting temporal and spatial scales, but we know that they're not static. We know that forces beyond are changing in the world. Many areas are rapidly urbanizing. And the interesting thing about urbanization is that it's not a border to animals, right? So many livestock are brought into urban systems for keeping in backyards, for sale at markets. There are, of course, domestic pets common in urban systems, and wildlife can easily cross borders. So if you live in Lincoln, you might see foxes in your backyard. You most certainly see songbirds and squirrels and diverse other wildlife. So the changing world is also changing some of those patterns of human-animal contact. We also know that climate and weather systems are changing the way that humans and animals and plants and ecosystems interact. So whether we think about wildfire or drought or very intense storms that are impacting diverse areas of the world, those can change both contact and disease transmission. These are from the UN Environmental Program, the images at the top left, highlighting some of the other large-scale forces that have been shown to be associated with changing patterns of zoonotic disease existence and emergence. So when we have agricultural intensification, whether we're moving from backyard to more concentrated animal feeding systems, we can have shifts in the way that humans and livestock interact, as well as their connections to wildlife. We know that land use change on local to global scales is also affecting patterns of contact. And so whether we think about deforestation or agricultural conversion, or even changes to the built environment, paving greater areas, changing vegetation types, those can also influence the flow of pathogens, as we'll see in some of the coming stories. And then, of course, climate change, I think, is overarching in this picture in reshaping the distributions of people, animals, and our environments. So that's a lot to hold when we think about all of the forces interacting and shaping interconnected health. And we can think about this in the case of any disease, right? I just use that as a general pathogen scenario, but there are also some very relevant, timely examples. So you might have encountered lately and regularly in the news concern about H5N1 high-path avian influenza. So this is a virus that can be moved about and carried by wildlife hosts, by waterfowl and other migratory birds, so it can be distributed widely at geographic scales. It can cross over to domestic poultry. So it can go into backyard flocks, into commercial poultry production systems, into concentrated feeding operations when there's contact between wild and domestic hosts. And sometimes with contact with, especially the poultry operations, it can spill over to people. And so those patterns have been observed for years with avian influenza and high-path avian influenza. But what we're seeing now is growing global concern at the diversity of species affected. So there's been a tremendous amount of concentration focused on the wildlife distribution of avian influenza, not only among wild bird hosts who are being affected throughout the world, but also transmission to and spillover into animals like seals and other marine mammals, into wild marine birds, into foxes and other carnivores. So there's a lot of concern about how is this landscape changing. And then when avian influenza gets into a host that's effective at mixing influenza viruses like a pig, we have growing concern about change in the pathogen and the ability to spread between people. So there's concern about pandemic risk too. I'm not going to dive into this example. I know Mark Vartiska is going to talk about waterfowl later in the seminar series, and this is a critical issue there as well. But I just wanted to point out the flood of attention that this has gotten in just even the past few months, as well as over the past few years. So thinking about the impacts on livestock production and egg supply chains in different areas of the United States and world. Thinking about spillover into unusual hosts like marine mammals and polar bears and spread between mammals and the potential for the virus to change in those hosts as well. And I want to point out another piece of this complexity, like we saw in that triangle diagram, is that the flyways illustrated here, so on the bottom right, these are paths of global migration for different bird species. And you can see that they cover huge portions of the world. And so when we think about how do you manage a pathogen that has connections from wildlife to domestic hosts to people potentially, that can spread globally with different birds moving in natural migration, how do we address and manage a challenge like that, a complex health challenge that can affect diverse hosts? And so I think when we hold ideas like that, like how do we address COVID-19 or a zoonotic pathogen of the moment or something that exists and we are learning more about, like high-path avian influenza, there are various factors shaping what happens in any environment, like this Nebraska watershed up to a global scale. And we know that can range from overarching climate change to community-level decision-making. And so when we think about the complexity and all the pieces involved in the puzzle, from social to ecological systems, it raises the question of how can we effectively respond? And though many cultures and traditions recognize integrated health and the connections between people, animals, and plants in the environment, in our traditional Western training systems and management approaches, there's often been very little communication between these spheres. So if you wanted to work with human health, you train as a nurse or a doctor. If you want to work in animal health, maybe you train as a veterinarian or ecologist, or you train as a plant health specialist. And by building those focal areas or silos, it has allowed specialization, certainly in medicine and health, but it misses the overlap between them and the potential for new solutions that can be drawn together by thinking across these spheres, as well as thinking about where they are situated in our social ecological systems. So One Health is an approach to address that challenge, the complexity of zoonotic disease and other shared health challenges. And it draws together people from different backgrounds and disciplines and perspectives to try to link health across humans, domestic animals, wildlife, plants, and our shared ecosystems. So when we think about that, it's not only interdisciplinary collaboration. Certainly we need that, right? Certainly we need to think about people working in wildlife, collaborating with people working in water and people working in domestic animal systems. But it's also thinking about who's on the teams and who's at the table for these big challenges. So not only within our universities can we do a better job of integration, but thinking about how to effectively work with state and federal agencies or nonprofit organization partners, as well as communities who are on the front lines of many of these challenges themselves. So One Health is bringing together these more holistic teams to try to gain the ability to effectively address really big problems. So hopefully you see yourself somewhere in this list of people. There are diverse types of people that wind up on various health teams for different challenges, but it's cutting across the natural sciences, certainly. There's been a big effort to integrate climate scientists and environmental scientists into people who are working on health or ecology or biology of animal populations and human populations. There's also been a really strong effort to integrate the social sciences, so bringing in perspectives from economists and sociologists, as well as drawing from anthropologists and other humanities disciplines. And I think really there's a struggle in One Health to truly integrate across the arts and humanities, which I want to touch on later. But I think there's a critical role for people who are skilled at connecting with communities, people who are artists and storytellers who can help navigate some of these really complex health topics and engage in dialogues with the people who are experiencing them. So One Health, I'm going to talk a lot about One Health in Nebraska, but certainly exists at different scales. This is from the CDC, highlighting their One Health messaging. So there's an Office of One Health in our Centers for Disease Control, so anchored in the US federal government. And then in the past years, there's been a really exciting and intensive effort to link One Health across large international stakeholders. So the World Health Organization, the World Organization for Animal Health, the Food and Agriculture Organization, or FAO, and the UN Environmental Program have come together to collaboratively develop their own definition of One Health. I think if you can read this definition from where you're sitting, it's a very broad scale and systems thinking approach to thinking about working across those human health, animal health, and biodiversity or environment programs. So I think that's an exciting development. And certainly there is response to this prompted by the COVID-19 pandemic, right? That was a nice sense of urgency for really coming together for collaborative approaches. But I wanted to talk about some of the ways that One Health goes beyond zoonotic disease. So shared diseases are used really commonly as an example of One Health approaches, but I think we can think more broadly about different forces and types of challenges that connect the health of people and animals in our shared environments. So we could think about air and water quality. I think the water quality piece will become critically relevant for the water seminar series today. But certainly if we're thinking about industrial pollution or particulate matter from wildfires, we know that those can have broad health effects and certainly could be approached through a One Health lens. The water quality ones I wanted to highlight here are ones that are not pathogen driven. They're ones that certainly have to deal with contamination or different things in the water that are causing problems, but separating a little bit from the pathogen focus. So the picture on your bottom right is of a harmful algal bloom where toxins can cause really significant health impacts to domestic animals, wildlife, as well as people who are involved in contacting this. There's also the global question of plastic pollution on the bottom left. We're still actively learning about the impacts of large-scale as well as microplastic pollution and what it means for human, animal, and ecosystem health. And I think there's going to be a lot of evolving research in this area as our understanding grows of how those plastics also are linked to different types of chemicals as well as to some pathogens and can transport them at large scale as well. We can also think about non-communicable diseases. So if we think about obesity, it's a very big concern in many elements of the US population. You can sort of see the CDC obesity map to the upper right. And I might have my directions backward here when I'm looking at the monitor. But it's also a really big concern in many pet populations. So lots of people have a pet who would be classified as overweight or obese. And by thinking across that species boundary, there may be shared solutions in not only understanding biological causes of that disease, but also in thinking about creative solutions to reduce obesity levels in humans and animals. And then I think this is a really exciting area on the bottom from my perspective that I think will expand rapidly over the next decade in One Health, and that's thinking about integrated mental health. So our mental health, as we've seen in discussions following the pandemic, is incredibly closely tied to our connections to other people, our connections to animals, and our connections to natural areas. There's a lot of evidence of the vital role of nature in human health and well-being, especially mental health. And so the bottom picture on your left of kayaking on the Platte River is bringing in that human-nature bond. But there are also some really interesting mental health connections that I think tie together the water, livestock, wildlife, human system. So on the bottom right, this is an article talking about mental health in ranchers, where significant droughts led to die-offs of livestock populations and critically affected the livelihoods as well as the mental health of people raising those livestock. And so we see a chain of the environmental change and water availability impacting livestock health and mortality, and then having a direct impact on human mental health. And I think there are so many connections like that that haven't been fully explored, so I do think this is an expanding area to consider as well. So what are the key issues in One Health in Nebraska, right? I asked you each to envision a connection point in the landscape that you imagined. So when we survey stakeholders here, we consistently get feedback about these 4 areas. So one being zoonotic disease, especially vector-borne diseases like mosquito and tick-borne diseases. So we might think of West Nile virus and Lyme disease in those categories. And even those are not waterborne diseases, certainly water is playing a role in the distribution of those vector populations. Water quality and quantity is always front and center, especially in discussions in Nebraska, whether we're talking about nitrite contamination or whether thinking about runoff and nutrient enrichment or pathogen flow off of the terrestrial landscape. And then we have antimicrobial resistance commonly comes up as a thread, which does have some water connections. And I think this 4th category really captures a lot of broader connections through irrigation and livestock production, thinking about food security and sustainable rural livelihoods. So all of those concerns, I think, are relevant globally as well. They're ones that expand beyond the borders of Nebraska. So that's why I wanted to put the and beyond segment in here. So we have a Nebraska One Health program that is established and growing, and we're focused on the directions for the future. So we're excited to have input from anyone interested as well. And a lot of our efforts focus on bringing together collaborative teams, and that's within and beyond the university, to address some of those core health challenges that I just mentioned. And there's really a focus on integrating research, teaching, outreach, and extension systems to be able to address these shared health challenges. And so that sounds nice, right? It sounds great. Let's all work together. Let's improve the health and have healthy ecosystems and animals and people. And as it turns out, that's often very hard to do in practice. And so I wanted to take us on a little journey of what can One Health look like in practice, and how does it relate to the theme of water and livestock and wildlife. So I think many people, when they envision a One Health approach, if they've heard about the recent pandemic or they're thinking about wildlife human viral transmission, might picture something like this, right? People in biosecure PPE who are sampling animals like bats and primates and rodents for pathogens and looking for the next virus to emerge. Certainly that is a critical example of One Health, looking in human and animal and overlapping environmental populations for pathogens. But I think One Health can be envisioned much more broadly, and I think there are lots of different stories that can illustrate how One Health connects water, livestock, wildlife, and people. So for today, when I mentioned that I wanted you to have your personal image of a place, I want you to think about how it connects to the 3 One Health stories that I want to share with you. Each of these could easily be multiple classes or an in-depth presentation, so I'm just going to give you a little overview and highlight some of the connections and really focus on the approach being used rather than specific results from any of these studies. If you're interested, I'm of course happy to discuss. So where do we start with One Health stories that link people, wildlife, and domestic animals? So there are many throughout the globe, and I want to share 2 from the US, 1 from California, 1 from Nebraska, and then 1 from the Beyond portion of my title that's focused on work in East Africa. So we're going to travel together through these scenarios as examples of how people are using One Health approaches, and I'll try to highlight where Nebraska One Health as a program is involved as well. So the first one is about seeing landscape level connections and thinking about solutions to pathogen pollution that can move from terrestrial to aquatic environments. So thinking about our terrestrial watersheds and how pathogens flow off them into freshwater or marine systems. This example is from coastal California, so we're really going to focus on the ocean side, but it's applicable anywhere that you have the land to water connection. And so this one really starts in the sea. So many of you might recognize this cultural California icon, the southern sea otter. People love these. They go to the California coast to see them. They look cute and fuzzy, but they are facing a lot of challenges in their environment. They were hunted almost to the point of extinction along the California coast and rebounded when there were treaties put in for their protection. But their population didn't expand as rapidly as people thought it would. And so studies into what was happening with their health and reproduction pointed to terrestrial pathogens causing deaths and disease in sea otters. And the pathogens that were highlighted were Toxoplasma gondii, a protozoan parasite, which I'll tell you a little about, as well as related pathogens like Sarcocystis neurona. There are no quizzes on these pathogen names, so we'll just go with the parasite flow story. So Toxoplasma is arguably one of the most successful parasites on the planet. I'm telling you this One Health story because this is how I got started in One Health when I was a graduate student in California. And Toxoplasma has impacts on the health of people, especially immunosuppressed people, as well as pregnant women who are infected for the first time during pregnancy. It can cause abortions in livestock, including sheep and goats, so it's a really important agricultural pathogen. And it can cause critical impacts on sensitive wildlife populations. Beyond the sea otters, we know it's causing huge conservation concern in Hawaiian monk seals, as well as Maui and Hector's dolphins in New Zealand. So there really is a global distribution to this pathogen as well. And one thing that makes it really interesting in these connections is that it is a pathogen that has a terrestrial source. All of the research on Toxoplasma for the last century has pointed to cats, domestic and wild cats, as the source of the Toxoplasma oocyst, that red circle in the middle. And these extremely hardy environmental stage, the oocysts, can stay in the environment after they're shed by cats. They can build up and they can be swept off with freshwater runoff following precipitation. And they can make their way into streams and rivers. They can go out into freshwater environments or into marine systems where sensitive wildlife populations are impacted and where other animals and people can be exposed. And so I've tried to simplify the loading and flow of that pathogen to highlight the critical role of water in moving this parasite that's shed by cats on land into aquatic system where wildlife hosts are affected. So if we just looked at one piece of that, if we just looked at the cat or if we looked at the sea otter, we might miss the importance of the water linkage as well as what the water is flowing through. And so in California, we know that diverse hosts can shed this, like mountain lions and bobcats, as well as pet and stray and feral cats. But the system is more complicated. It's also maintained by predator-prey cycles. It goes into livestock populations where people could eat infected meat that's not cooked well and become exposed. So the water piece is critical. There are 3 different ways that Toxoplasma gets into its hosts. So you can eat undercooked meat. That might be a prey item. It might be an undercooked piece of goat meat, for example, that is infected. You can ingest Toxoplasma through water or contaminated foods from the water, so contaminated berries or produce. And you can get it vertically from an infected mom, both in humans and animals. And what's interesting is that the meat route and the vertical route have gotten a lot of attention over the past years. But the water route is proving to be a critical source of exposure for humans in diverse areas of the world, as well as for wildlife. And so decades of research has brought together teams of veterinarians, of epidemiologists, of ecologists, of oceanographers, people who study marine food webs. And by building a holistic team that can integrate those different disciplines and elements, we're able to see how the pathogen moves from the terrestrial sources into the sea, where the sea otters are exposed. And that happens all along the coastal California watershed you see on this map. And we can model it working with different tools from experts in genetics, as well as experts in hydrology who can track pathogen flow across the landscape. And I bring this up because humans can be a recipient of this disease, but we play a critical role in the landscape decisions that determine how it flows as well. More paved and built environments can accelerate the flow. Heavier precipitation patterns and more intense storm events linked to climate change can also enhance the flow of the parasite to the ocean. So we see a lot of connections grounded in human actions that are changing how this parasite interacts with different hosts. And so we can ask ourselves, how can we think about the water and terrestrial systems here to protect human and domestic animal and wildlife health? And that really comes with managing not just the cats or managing not just the sea otters, but thinking at a much broader scale of where can we manage the landscape, where can we change our decision making, whether it's in reducing feral cat populations or bringing in solutions like increased riparian areas and buffers and wetlands that will reduce pathogen flow through wetlands into the ocean. And we can think about this in California, where this story is based, and I'm just giving you a little snippet of it. But we can also think about the many things that might flow off the landscape in a place like Nebraska. So we can think about the connections with nutrients flowing off, with pathogens from livestock production flowing off the landscape, with plastic flow from agricultural and urban systems into aquatic systems. So there are a lot of ways that we can think of this, but One Health, by bringing together people focused on the domestic animal health and the health of wildlife and the ecosystems and the people living together in them, is creating discussions and solutions that allow us to have a more holistic view and to think about how ecosystem-based approaches, like managing our built environments or the way that we have storm drains structured or the way that we have domestic pets distributed in the landscape, can all provide a different road than just trying to address the cats or just trying to protect the health of the sea otters. So that's my first One Health story. And even though I'm personally involved in this research, Nebraska One Health is involved in supporting a global network of researchers trying to take a One Health approach to land-to-sea pathogen flow and trying to protect human and domestic animal and wildlife health related to this parasite. So my second whirlwind story of One Health focuses on a critical health challenge in Nebraska. So thinking about urgent pesticide contamination challenges. So many people in the audience who are from the state may be familiar with the Alt-N facility that was processing agricultural treated seeds, so leftover seeds that were treated with neonicotinoid pesticides and fungicides. And those were produced into ethanol, which was sold, but the wet cake and the water remaining were left in the environment near Mead, Nebraska. And we know that they were not only kept at the facility, the Alton facility that you see with these giant green piles of the wet cake from the treated seeds, but they were also distributed throughout communities as a soil supplement. So extremely high levels of neonicotinoid pesticides, which we know can have critical impacts on honeybees and other insect populations, as well as fungicides, which can also broadly, in fact, impact many types of animal and human populations, are distributed at high concentration in this area. So how do you respond to an urgent pesticide contamination problem that can have broader human, animal, and environmental health consequences? And so for the Nebraska One Health program, we were part of a team with UNNC and Creighton University and partners at the U.S. Geological Survey to try to come up with a way to integrate the health impacts across all of those groups to understand what is happening with the pesticides in the environment and how to manage a situation like this where you have distributed contamination without clear knowledge of what will come from that. A lot of pesticide studies just focus on one pesticide, but this is a mix of many pesticides. So it has some novel questions related to what that does to human, animal, and ecosystem health. So we're part of this with partners at UNL who are focused on soil and water, as well as Judy Woosmart's Bee Lab that triggered the alarm for this with honeybee impacts. And the Nebraska One Health program is helping to fill in data on many of the wildlife systems. So we're really focusing on amphibians, like the tadpoles you see here, as well as, or the tadpole seining approach that you see here, as well as looking at songbirds as sentinels so that we can understand how pesticides are distributed. And you can see Dennis Ferraro and Shabani Mueller and Nikki Klosterman, 3 of our key people on this team, are deep in the mud trying to get these wildlife sentinels. So there's a lot of in-depth field work happening here to support integrating across vegetation and soil and water and wildlife sentinels, and to combine that with the efforts of our human health partners who are looking at impacted populations in the communities and trying to understand exposures. So there's a lot of connection there, and part of it is not just the research, but also the training approach as well. So we've used this to build a One Health experiential learning program where we bring students to the field to work with mentors in the community and across faculty in the system to get interdisciplinary experience in addressing a complex health challenge like this example of pesticide contamination. And we have this expanding to other One Health projects where we have peer-to-peer mentoring, we have students training across disciplinary boundaries on questions of human-animal health connection, as well as water linkages. We're also integrating this into partnerships with Extension. So you'll see the PPE training as well as disease diagnostic activities happening with Extension partners to try to increase youth One Health awareness in the state and to think about partnerships through 4-H and FFA as well. So my final One Health story is the Beyond story. So I mentioned that a lot of people were aware of the COVID-19 pandemic, but we know that the global burden of zoonotic pathogens really falls on poor livestock keepers throughout much of the world. And so this is a story where I'm going to ask you to travel to East Africa, to Tanzania and Rwanda, to think about some of these water connections in a landscape that has differing gradients of arid and wet landscapes. So this is a project that was linking livestock health, human nutrition, water, and livelihoods in changing environments. So a little bit of a departure from the pathogens and the pesticide contamination. Certainly pathogens could play a role here, but really thinking about what water and water scarcity mean for health and nutrition and livelihoods. And this also takes a One Health team. And the changing environment piece, this is the Great Ruaha River that flows through the area of Tanzania that I had in green on that map. And this is what it looks like on the right side of the left side of the screen for part of the year where we have incredibly rich flow that supports wildlife and human and domestic animal populations. But due to upstream rice development and due to environmental pressure and change, the river is now drying for significant portions of the year. And there are small pools that people and livestock and wildlife are required to share to access drinking water resources. So you can imagine that has a lot of impacts on health and nutrition, right? Decreased access to water, decreased water available for crop production, contamination of water, safety for the people who have to go further to harvest water. It can also have indirect and direct impacts on livestock production through decreased water and pasture. And of course, there could be pathogen sharing at these shared water resources. But the picture is of a livestock dip for ticks. Ticks are a really important pathogen group or health challenge in East Africa as well. And without water, you can't run cattle through a livestock dip like this to coat them in the medicine that prevents ticks and tick-borne disease. So there can be really interesting, more diverse connections beyond what's in the small pools of water themselves. And of course, we have impacts on wildlife in these systems as well, who are forced to have limited access to water, which might also increase other problems like crop raiding when they're looking for resources for food. So these all become very complex interconnected systems where we're thinking across the boundaries of health and food security and water security and livelihoods. And it was really a community-based approach integrated with pastoralist communities and farming communities to try to say, how can we have more resilient health? And working with partners from across our Tanzania research team and some US research partners as well, we developed integrated education models, working with community development specialists and livestock extension specialists and the community members themselves to try to address some of these critical livestock health and human nutrition challenges. And I can't go in depth here, but it really drew upon the rich partnerships with communities across the area, with integration of government partners and extension partners here too. So some echoes of the same story that we see in the US. We've expanded this approach to think about connections with child stunting in Rwanda, looking at the connections between livestock and livestock pathogens, as well as shared water systems with wildlife people and domestic animals. And Ben Diambaje from the School of Natural Resources is leading that. And so if you look at that illustrated watershed on the left, we see a lot of different types of human-animal connections. And it's not just where we get our water, it's how we access all the systems around it related to agriculture and education and commerce. And so this has led to some really exciting and evolving community partnerships where two of the women from our project, Jessica and Eliza, who you see pictured here, are leading women-led One Health initiatives in many of our partner communities. And they're working with community members to address challenges that range from wildlife-human connections to challenges of livestock production and healthy livestock for human consumption, as well as dealing with challenges of too much water and flooding and producing rice in situations like the one you see on your right, as well as really dry landscapes and dealing with the challenges of drought. And I bring this up because they're working extensively with partners across the communities and local governments, but they're also trying to iterate planning and training to really create local creative solutions to shared health challenges. And one of these, because many of the women are illiterate or semi-literate because they haven't had the chance to go to school, especially in pastoralist populations, has been to bring in art as a tool to talk about livestock health, where women are often excluded in other training approaches. And my experience in using art as a tool in this scenario and working on iterative development of like how you communicate livestock health and human nutrition and water linkages through pictures and simple text has really spurred my love of art science connections. And that's something that's shared with many members of our Nebraska One Health team. And so I'm just going to highlight a couple of those art science connections, and then we'll wrap it up in case there are any questions. So we use interactive mapping with humans, animals, and water and environmental systems with kids at outreach events. We have a wonderful tick and tick-borne disease education group led by Louise Lynch O'Brien, our One Health Extension educator, who are using art and creative messaging to try to help people understand how to cope with tick-borne diseases in Nebraska. We're also actively exploring the connections between biodiversity and health, bringing in art and storytelling and new ways of knowing. And so we are experimenting with after-school clubs that integrate different art methodologies and story methodologies with kids in Lincoln, and connecting those with graphic design students at UNL. So these are collaboratively designed t-shirts about endangered species, and you'll see many of them feature water connections, like understanding the health and habitat of native fisheries. And we're trying to think about how communication between the university and public schools, as well as communication across cultural boundaries, can provide really exciting new ideas for One Health as well. So we also have art and storytelling programs in our partner schools in Tanzania, where the students have identified really cool linkages between the people and the animals and the environments they share. Everything from what it looks like in scenarios of drought on the upper right to a healthier water system on the bottom, how people access water, and how people are affecting water. So we're using this as a way to talk across cultures visually, and hopefully in the future to really investigate what that means for people's understanding of how our health is connected to that of the natural world, as well as people, or wildlife and domestic animals around us. So I think the what if question that I want to end with here is, what if when we think about the places we love that you identified earlier, or we think about the stories that I shared, what if we can envision those through different cultures and different disciplines, and through the ways that animals and plants might experience them? We're learning so much about communication across species boundaries as well as cultural boundaries, and I think that there are many opportunities for expanding One Health, not only to integrate research and teaching and outreach, but to really integrate much broader perspectives that we hopefully will build the solutions that we need for some of these challenges that we've not effectively addressed. So all the stories I told were about looking through the lens of interconnection and thinking about human, animal, plant, environmental linkages. I know that those were quick, broad brush approaches to the different systems, but I hope it gives you a sense of how One Health approaches might relate to really diverse health challenges. So I went over a little. I think Ann's going to forgive me. But I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have, or to go more in depth in any of those approaches. I wanted to give you a broad view of what we're involved in with Nebraska One Health and different roads where you might be interested in engaging.
So let's give Liz a quick round of applause. For our in-person audience, raise your hand if you have a question, and for our online, you can put it in the chat.
Great talk, Liz. I always enjoy hearing what's going on in the One Health world. And this is a question that I know that's been on your mind, so I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about it. So One Health, by its very nature, is very interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary. It connects a lot of people, which is both a strength and a weakness. And so one of the things that I'd be curious to hear more about is, what can institutions do, or who should be supporting One Health in an idealistic world? How do these projects go forward?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Jess. And I know that you know it's been on my mind too from our conversations. So I think one of the big challenges that you pointed out about One Health is that our institutional structures are not always set up to support collaborative work, whether it's interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary work within a university, or whether it's with external partnerships with agencies or nonprofit organizations, non-governmental organizations, or communities. And so I think that sometimes the most valuable lessons we might learn from a One Health research project are what didn't work. And we know that some collaborative teams will fail, but I think there are things that we can do to help support One Health moving forward from the structure side in the future. And so one of the big pieces at the university, since we're all sitting here now, is I think a really deep thought process on how do we support interdisciplinary work? How do we understand what that means when you have 30 people on a paper? What does it mean when half of your work is talking to communities and doesn't show up as a publication or a presentation, but is still incredibly meaningful work for advancing health? And so I think some of the ways that we evaluate people and evaluate teams and define success at the university are going to have to adapt and change. And I don't know exactly where that starts. I think it can start from the ground up and from the top down. I think that there is genuine interest in having more collaborative approaches. And I think both at the university level as well as the broader society level, we are all working to try out different ways to make that happen, and learning as we go. But certainly there are barriers in place, even if we want to do collaborative and interdisciplinary work. Any other questions?
Okay, seeing no more questions, I think we will end it there today. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Liz, for speaking. And we hope to see you again in a few weeks at our next seminar. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.